American foreign policy, I think, has to be purposeful and inspiring, based on clear goals driven by sound strategies, not by Twitter tantrums.
So it seems like one of the major issues that will dominate the next US general election will be whether America will return to its traditional role at the head of the table on the world stage. After all, the world is a scary place. Maybe we would all feel better if there was a more clear assertion of American power. Okay, welcome to this first video in my new channel where I review books, talk about ideas and sometimes just ponder about the big issues in international politics. Today I'll be talking a bit about the relatively recent book called The Jungle Grows Back by Robert Kagan. He's an American foreign policy thinker, historian, and has been an advisor to Democrats and Republicans, including big names like Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, John McCain, and he was a speechwriter for George Shultz, one of Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State. He also co-founded the Project for the New American Century.
It's a Washington-based think tank, as we say, that specializes in foreign affairs.
And there are about 17 members of this so-called think tank who were in top positions in the Bush-Cheney administration.
Anyway, all this is to say that Kagan represents a line of thinking about America's role in the world and what it should be that is reasonably well established among top government officials. In short, Kagan is an insider, although he would probably argue that the current administration doesn't reflect his line of thinking as well as he would like.
Again, this is what's sort of worrying about Trump, is that he wants to push countries very hard, but at the same time, he's not prepared to deal with the possible consequences of that if it does lead to some kind of military confrontation.
So as an insider, the perspective he articulates has been important to plenty of administrations in the past and is likely to continue to be so. So it's probably worth having a look at what he thinks about the world, why he thinks that, and what that might mean for American power going forward. Well, Kagan's perspective is shaped by the prevailing notion that the world is a perilous and uncaring place. In particular, he doesn't think much of human beings or human nature. In fact, humans, in Kagan's view, are naturally just awful to each other. And human nature hasn't changed substantially from how it's always been. We're still fundamentally the same creatures that would murder each other for some temporary advantage on the African savannah, enslave each other for profit, and essentially the same animals that have carried out countless genocides throughout history. So what has changed, and why we don't necessarily go to bed worrying about hordes of invading neighbours, are only two things in Kagan's view. First is technological advancement. That's improved our lives dramatically, but it's also given us the false perspective that we have improved. The second change is something to do with the system that we function within, the emergence of a global hegemon. That is to say, an overwhelmingly powerful superpower capable of enforcing its will and creating and enforcing a set of rules for behaviour. He's clearly referring to the role that the US has played, particularly since the end of the Second World War.
It's important to remember that this order that we've enjoyed, this period of the past 70 years where there's been a sort of explosion of democracy, an explosion of economic prosperity compared to the rest of history, and peace among the great powers, is an aberration. Nations have generally been almost constantly at war, tyranny has been the norm, and most peoples have lived in poverty.
But what is key to these ideas is that the liberal international order functions because, first of all, the United States is on top, and secondly, the United States doesn't act like a despot. It doesn't take advantage of its position to extract wealth, force other societies to subjugation and so on. Rather, it would allow all states and societies to prosper, even former enemies, think of Japan and Germany after the Second World War, so long as they accept American leadership and adopt a common rule book for behaviour. For Kagan, there's no natural arc towards justice or a better world. No, human beings are no better than they've ever been. They're just as likely to do cruel and terrible things as they have throughout history. The only thing that's different is that the structure that we've given ourselves through this American leadership and the liberal world order has restrained our capacity. So when we think about international relations and the big questions that we want to ask about that, maybe the right questions we should ask are not things like who's going to be the next superpower or how can we make a better world, but how on earth do we cling on to this system and make sure that we preserve it, because we might lose it far more quickly than we might otherwise have expected.
I am worried.
I will honestly fess up to being worried about whether, if we're not careful, we will through lack of action, through misunderstanding, through foolishness.
Lose control of a liberal order from which we've all benefited so much, and let me tell you, it is fragile.
Well, he does go on to talk a little bit about why it is the United States that is uniquely qualified to carry out this leadership role.
The founders of our democratic system created a system which I think recognized that human beings were like that and tried to create a system that would channel their passions and angers and hatreds in the most productive way possible.
Overall, Kagan is pretty clear that America is capable of making terrible mistakes in its leadership role.
We understand what has troubled everyone.
But by and large, what he would say is that we're far better off with the US playing that role in charge than we would be without it. So therefore, problems and mistakes are packaged in with the price, if you like. Of course, the point of writing this book is as a warning. He argues that the jungle is in danger of growing back, and he says there are a range of threats that we have to take seriously.
We all know that if you aren't constantly tending the garden, then natural forces, weeds and vines and all the other things want to come back and reclaim the land. And I think that is a good analogy for this liberal world order, which natural forces are always working to undermine.
So what should we make of Kagan's argument? For me, the primary action whenever I think or interact with these ideas is one of sort of an uncomfortable fascination. I think perhaps due to my somewhat cynical view on human nature, the fragility of life, and my agnosticism about whether there's any form of higher meaning or higher purpose to our lives. At first glance, Kagan's argument is disturbingly seductive. Rather like Hobbes's Leviathan, a book about the nasty, brutish and short lives we might lead if we don't accept the need for enforcement of order over our lives, The Jungle Grows Back really focuses on persuading us of its perspective by presenting an image of a natural world that is so awful that will be driven into the arms of American hegemony simply to avoid what would be a much worse fate otherwise. But does this necessarily follow? Kagan rather rapidly sweeps over US foreign policy failures in Vietnam and so on, claiming that these are just the price of doing business.
There is no foreign policy that is going to be without failure. We focus on the mistakes that we made in Iraq and Vietnam. We never talk about the mistakes we made by not doing anything.
But then, what wouldn't be excused by this argument? For example, in 1950, US General Douglas MacArthur argued for the use of nuclear bombs in Korea and China to stop the advancement of communism. If this had happened, would this simply be swept in the same argument? What about things like the false flag operations? For instance, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where the US falsified an attack on its naval assets so it could draw its military into a war. What about where the US has targeted civilians, whether deliberately or by mistake, where it's tortured its enemies or propped up brutal regimes and undermined democracy? Are all these simply to be written off as the price of doing business? Now, don't take what I'm saying as mere American bashing. Indeed, if Americans and the US aren't really that different from anyone else, isn't it somewhat problematic to then base an entire system for global security on the very idea of American exceptionalism? But the main critique I have is that Kagan's argument is obviously born of a very strongly US/European worldview. He's right, of course, that 70 years of liberal world order after World War II came after 500 or so years of constant European warfare and coincided with decolonisation and the collapse of European empires around the world. But the point here is that Kagan's argument doesn't even attempt to look at the world through anybody else's eyes or from anyone else's perspective. For example, while it might be fine for me to suggest that the world is a far better place because of US leadership from my British/Canadian perspective, but if your life experience is not like this, is not like mine, and that your perception or your experience of US power has been one that's been detrimental to your life experiences or your life possibilities, whether that's directly or indirectly, then the distinction between Kagan's limited virtues of order versus the horrors of chaos is not quite as salient. In other words, perhaps the difference between the garden and the jungle that he's so keen to base his whole idea on isn't the same for everyone. But what do you think? Leave me a comment down below. If you've liked this video, please give it a like. Subscribe to the channel and click the notification buttons, and we'll see you next time.